Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, part of the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we discuss how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. For last week's podcast, we began the first of a two-part series on a concept called the spiral of silence, which is an attempt to explain why people don't speak up even when they know dangerous things like ideological intolerance and even hatred are well afoot. This is a problem for democracy because it can create an environment wherein people will go along with potentially dangerous opinions rather than challenge them. This week, we will discuss how this concept can apply to people withholding even objectively true factual information in order to protect the interests of an in-group, for example, a country, a company, a university, or even a set of friends. This has the potential to block valuable information, which thereby impoverishes the public debate. Okay, hello, and today we're going to be talking about self-censorship. So this is probably something that you have almost certainly encountered. You know, when you make an observation about the world, you notice something, and then you feel like you can't express that thing. It's like for example, if I don't know, your wife buys a new dress, if you're a bloke, or if you're a woman for that matter, your wife buys a new dress and you think it looks absolutely hideous, or she has a new haircut and she says, yeah, does this look great? Maybe it does look great, and you'd say, yes, yeah, it looks great. And maybe it doesn't look great, and you will likely still say, yes, it looks great, and then find some soft way of breaking it later down the line, or not, maybe.
Or not,
or not. That it doesn't look great.
So it's a good tool to smooth social relations, right? It can absolutely be one way of managing social relationships.
So we all do it. We all lie at times.
Probably quite a bit. Probably several times a day we all do this, where we hold our tongue. We make a decision not to comment on something, sometimes not to give our opinion, sometimes, as this author is arguing, not to maybe tell the truth. That's sort of like your example, something that is factually true, and we choose not to mention it.
So we've been looking at an article that discusses self-censorship, not really in terms of, not telling your girlfriend, wife, boyfriend, whatever, that their new t-shirt doesn't suit them quite as much as they believe it does. But in terms of the more political dimension, as I'm sure you've noticed, I mean, you probably wouldn't be here if you hadn't. It's getting increasingly uncomfortable, impossible to even describe reality, for example. I think the best example off the top of my head would be the George Floyd protests, that they led to a massive Ferguson effect in which violent crime skyrocketed, disproportionately impacting upon African-American communities more than other communities, of course. But you're not supposed to make that observation. That's something that you kind of hold your tongue, even though the evidence is pretty much crystal clear. And there are others. So this is the kind of self-censorship we're looking at. The article we're looking at doesn't actually describe the George Floyd protests. It focuses on Israel, but Israel's just an example. You can extrapolate from that pretty much anything. And the underpinning psychological phenomena, I think, are the same. So would you care to introduce the article, Elizabeth? What's it called?
Sure. So the article's title is Self-Censorship as a Socio-Political Psychological Phenomenon. So that's a 3- socio-political psychological phenomenon, conception and research. So the they describe in the author Daniel Bar-Tal describes the present article provides a comprehensive conceptual framework of self-censorship and examines it from various angles with empirical examples. So that's the quick and dirty.
So I guess the first place to start would be to define self-censorship. How do the authors define it, and how do we define it?
Right. So the authors suggest that, or the author, I should say, it's not, this is not plural, right?
Oh, I
It's
thought it was
just
plural.
no, just the one.
My mistake.
That self-censorship is the withholding of a truth. So the author specifically says that self-censorship is defined as the act of intentionally and voluntarily withholding information from others in the absence of formal obstacles. So in this case, you voluntarily, censor yourself in order to avoid, some sort of public censorship. It might harm you. It might harm others. This is not the same in the author's conceptualization as withholding your opinion.
Like the dress or the t-shirt.
Right. In this case, it's specifically withholding known truthful information because it would potentially have a negative effect on the self, reflect negatively on the revealer of the information, because it might have negative implications for some other specific individual or group.
And that it might have wouldn't.
That it might have negative implications for the in-group, that it might have negative implications for a valued belief, that it might have implications for a third-party person, group, or society. So that's the, self-censorship would be then carried out in this author's conception by maybe gatekeepers that he writes about, maybe journalists, high-powered politicians, or military officers, and then and then individuals below them then who make the decision to sort of follow along. So
I can see why he's making that distinction. It is a he, I think. Why he's making that distinction? Yeah.
David.
Well, you never know how people gender identify.
That's true. Daniel. I lied. It's Daniel.
Daniel. So the author comes from an Israeli background and is using conflict, looking at war or scenarios surrounding war as the example.
Conflicts.
So I can see why. Let's just say why he is why he's doing that. But even I think he needs to think a little bit more about what truth is. So, for example, if I was to say, my son is a nice kid, is that an opinion or a fact? Well, it's an opinion, right?
Right.
But is it any less true to me than the sun rises in the east?
Right.
It might even be more true to me. Like, I would spend a lot more time thinking about why my son is a nice kid than I would do thinking about the banal, mundane fact that the sun rises in the east. It's a more powerful piece of information for me. It's more true to me. It's more personal to me. So when we're talking about truths, I don't think that we can necessarily neatly. I mean, we can say that this is subjective and this is objective, but subjective truths are also important, right?
Well, to get back to your discussion about the George Floyd and the Ferguson effect and stuff, and like maybe Roland Fryer's research, right?
Sure.
If we're talking about sort of maybe I can't quote chapter and verse some of those statistics or something right off the mark, right? Maybe I haven't memorized those.
Who can?
Does that mean then that that it wouldn't be that that's not factual, right? That because I don't have at hand, a list of statistics or something that I couldn't suggest that, or, say that, well, gosh, Roland Fryer's research or, statistics, bear this out. Well, what statistics, and it's like, oops, now I'm in trouble, right? Because I can't just rattle them off. So yeah, I think there's this, sort of a fine, a fine distinction, I guess. Very fine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too hard on the author because actually I like the paper, but it's just I'm nitpicking here. But even within, like, let's just look at Israeli defense history, for example. Even if you look at the biggest travesty in Israeli defense, which was the Yom Kippur War, the fact that this when basically Egypt launched a surprise attack on Israel and despite having inferior military forces, managed to really mess Israel up, managed to deal the most traumatic day in the history, easily the most traumatic day in the history of Israel as a nation state. The fact that they were able to do that was based on Israeli intelligence officials having the opinion that they would be incapable of doing that. Like, had Israeli intelligence defense officials had the opinion that they were capable of doing that, it would never have happened. So, opinions are important. That was a subjective truth that happened to be wrong, but it was extremely consequential. So I think that while the author kind of excludes subjective truths from analysis, I don't think there's any basis to do that, even within the context that he himself is referring to, which is Israel. So I don't think we should do it.
Yeah, I do understand. Again, as you said, I understand why he defined it this way. It does make his argument more clear. I think it narrows it so that he doesn't. I mean, it's already quite a lengthy paper, and if he had broadened it further, then then it would have been an even longer and more complicated paper. So I do think it makes that narrowing sort of helps make it more clear.
Then just say that.
Yeah.
I mean, just say this might, put it down as a footnote. This might apply subjectively, but for expediency, I'm not going to go into this.
That's a good point. And of course, we do have the whole section, which, I don't think we should necessarily talk about like up front, but, he does have the whole section about how this is not psychological. So of course I have a few, a whole section on that, which again, I think you're right. If he had made sort of a disclaimer up front that said, here's what this paper is about, here's what this paper is not about, and I'm going to talk about self-censorship in this sort of narrow way, maybe he also wouldn't have had to describe how it's not psychological, also.
It's like when somebody says, no, I'm not angry. I'm really not angry.
Yeah. Again, back to the life partner thing, right? Oh no, I'm not angry.
No. It's not psychological, like the last paper wasn't about critical social justice.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
The lady doth protest too much.
Yes,
in Shakespearean terms.
Yes. So I would love to hear your sort of, from your background, your sort of take on some of these, just sort of this long history that he's talking about self-censorship over long periods of time. I mean, we're not talking about, a year or, a couple of years, not even just during a war or just during a, combat period. But
so
long time, 10, 15, 20 years beyond.
So he uses, so his examples with Israel are particularly interesting, and it's, he talks about contextual factors, right? And Israel as a contextual factor is extremely unique. I would probably argue that there has never been a day in which the majority of Israelis have not felt they are at war. Like Israel has constantly, not officially, Israel has constantly been at war. So within postmodern thought, for example, there's this idea of identities changing. So, in Europe, for example, you might identify more with an American. If you're an English person, you might identify more with an American who does certain pastimes that you do. So, for example, if an American is really into hunting and you're really into hunting, and you own rifles and you go out and do it and all of the rest of it, your identity might be more closely aligned with that American than it would be with your fellow Brits. Similarly for Australians. Even more so politically, if you're an English conservative, we don't live in a world anymore wherein our interactions are done primarily with the people who exist geographically closest to us, right? As we are proof positive, right? It exists in a much more kind of multifaceted way. We're interacting with people on internet forums, on Facebook, on Messenger, on Zoom, via podcasts. And so our identities are aligning differently. So what's that meant in the UK or in America or in Australia is that we're identifying more with people who are like us in terms of what we do, what we believe, rather than our national sense of identity, our sense of patriotism, which has been, especially in the UK, but I think increasingly in America, has been in quite significant decline. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Certainly when I was a kid, we used to look at the Americans with waving the American flag, and we used to think,
yeah.
gosh,
I mean,
how silly. That's what we used to think.
July 4th, when I was growing up was huge. I mean, just a huge holiday. And I would say that, now I don't think it's just because I'm an adult. I just think that it's not. I didn't see my niece and nephew getting as excited about it. They didn't participate in parades and all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK, we used to look at the Americans with all of that kind of patriotism and think that it was silly. And that's not to say that there aren't Brits who are deeply patriotic. Of course there are, but there aren't very many of them. And I think that there are more Americans who feel like that presently than there are Brits. But it does seem to be in decline. So the philosopher I'm channeling here is a guy called Zygmunt Beaumont, who was one of the later, he died a few years ago, later postmodern thinkers. And he was, really looking at why is it that this is deteriorating? Why are you identifying more with, I don't know, hip hop music than you are your country? And he was saying that the state had, in many ways, ceased to become something that was identified with and admired and cherished and looked up to, a kind of a spiritual entity, you like, and it become more of a kind of a boring administrative unit, right? Not what the wokies would say. The wokies would say, oh, white supremacy and oppression. He wasn't saying that, but he was making a more sophisticated point. He was saying that it was more like the water board.
Mm-hmm.
You understand why it's there and why it exists, and it's necessary. But beyond that, you identify with it no more than you would your local electricity supplier.
Mm-hmm.
But you do identify with people who have similar opinions or similar hobbies, or as you do. So from that point of view, what is it that makes the state? What is it that causes you to identify with the nation state? What is it that causes? So the author notes, like, in terms of the causes for self-censorship. He said patriotism, Zionist ideology. He called it right wing. I wouldn't necessarily say that Zionism is right wing, but that's another discussion. So what is it that causes identity with the state? Any ideas?
I mean, you mean like what he well, okay.
Because he doesn't make this clear. Like he doesn't. He says that these things cause self-censorship because he's basically saying that there is a strong sense of identity that is aligned with Israel as a nation state, and this causes self-censorship amongst groups. He goes on and says, look, particularly with soldiers, because they're more aligned
Right.
with the state. But
So
he's not
if
just
we
talking
go,
about soldiers.
yeah, so if we go back, if we go in the Wayback Machine to when we were talking,
Way back.
the Wayback Machine, when we were talking to Spencer Case, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talked about was this sort of identity overlap with, you know, people in the military. Very much there's this identity overlap with the military and with, you know, with their country and that kind of stuff. And so your identity is very intertwined with, you know, like you said, there's a big difference from between that and sort of like, oh, it's just this administrative, you know, paper pushing, you know, whatever, oh, you know, bloat, right?
Right.
And so I do think that the author is making an argument that, and I think a good one. I think a good article, a good argument that, you know, this identification with a group, you know, is providing this explanation, because you're doing something that at the same time their survey respondents and interviewees say is wrong, self-censorship. Okay, so they identify in their studies, whether it's, again, whether, you know, they did a longitudinal study, a couple of survey studies that he's citing in here, over and over again, the journalists, the everyday people, whoever it is that's in their studies, is saying self-censorship is wrong, and it's associated with illiberalism, and you know, and it's you know, we shouldn't be engaging in that. We should be in a free and open society. And yet those exact same interviewees, survey respondents, and such will say, will do the qualification. However, in this case, my identification with the group means that I should not share information. I should hide. I should hide information, because that's what's going to ensure that, you know, they give the example that we keep morale up, soldiers' morale up, that the community's morale up, people, you know, who are living in areas that are in unrest, that if we share what we know, that it will actually make things worse. And so while self-censorship is sort of unpatriotic, my self-censorship is patriotic.
So this is really crucial for Israel, because if you ask anybody who's studied Israeli defense, will tell you that self-censorship caused the worst. So well known is what caused not just self-censorship, but there was people who were speaking out and they weren't listened to. So self-censorship and censorship caused the worst event, which was the aforementioned Yom Kippur War. And so Israel understands innately, because it suffered so badly because of self-censorship and censorship, just how important it is that people are able to speak freely. You know, I have a friend in the IDF who told me that in his unit, like if I can't remember exactly, but if 5 people agreed, or they all agreed, then the 5th person would have to pretend not to agree and give an argument against it in order to, you know, prevent this kind of rot of self-censorship setting in. So they recognize, the Israelis inherently recognize how dangerous it is, because they've suffered from it. So what the author does is he, you know, identifies Zionist ideology. I mean, we can go into that if you like, but I mean, Zionist ideology is basically that, you know, Israel is the chosen land of the Jewish people and their homeland. Not always, but it can go there. Or there are kind of atheistic iterations of it, which would be, you know, that it belongs to them and they're a force for good, and, you know, nationalism essentially. But why? This is the key that I want to really drill down on. Why is it that patriotism is causing this? Why is okay? So we say that patriotism causes self-censorship, right? That it makes you not say something because you don't want to tarnish the image of your country, for example, even though you recognize that your country is doing something bad. So why is this happening in Israel and not so much in the UK, for example? And I think there's a clear reason for this. And the author doesn't go into it, but I think it's really, 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 really important for what we're talking about, which is critical social justice, and that is that Israel is constantly in a state of war. It's constantly under attack. There are groups from Lebanon, from Palestine, Iran, historically Jordan and Egypt. Israel knows that if they let their guard down for just a second, they will be invaded. They constantly live in a state of fear. It's not like Britain or Japan, or America. Like who's going to invade America? Canada, Mexico? It's not going to happen. Just try it. But Israel really has always been and remains in a state of existential angst. It's constantly under threat, and this is what causes the patriotism, right? This is what causes the strong identity with people around you. I think that there have been studies, and I can't cite them off the top of my head, but there have been studies done with wolves, for example. And if you have lone wolves and you introduce the sound of, just via a speaker, of a pack of wolves howling in the distance, they will quickly form a pack, right? They will quickly band together in order to kind of face off against an external threat. And this is what I would argue would be causing the strong, tense sense of patriotism that then would encourage self-censorship. And I think this is kind of vital to our analysis here, because a couple of podcasts ago, we did terror management, right? Where we looked at, well, okay, why are people really suddenly buying into critical social justice now? It was a problem before the pandemic, but why are they buying into it during the pandemic? Well, because there is a sense of existential threat. There's COVID out there. COVID is threatening to kill you. There's, somebody's being killed in Minneapolis. They argue that this is indicative of a wider social problem. This sense of existential crisis, of angst, I would argue, is the same in Israel. Israel is genuinely under threat. Whereas the critical social justice people, the threat may or may not be real. It doesn't matter whether it's real, but they perceive it as being real, or at least the non-Machiavellian narcissistic ones do. And that's what creates the cohesion, I would argue.
I did not make that connection, and I really like that connection. I agree with you. So, I mean, what does he describe here? This, social identity, sort of, this overlap that I was, talking about, how the individual's self-concept is, sort of intertwined, with membership in some group, whether, he's talking about, the feeling of belonging, the willingness to belong. So you have to, like, this is something where you want to be in the group. The importance ascribed to belonging, the emotional attachment that you feel to the group, the commitment to benefit the group, considering the group as having highly valued qualities, and deferring to the group's norms and cultural symbols. So there's this, as you just described, this sort of sense of common fate, right, that draws us together, sort of concern for the welfare of the collective that might be driving this. Now, the author points out, and I think this is really I put a little note here, that not only, though, is this an argument for self-censorship, but it is also an argument for or some of the reason for whistleblowing. And I think I put a note on here because it's like, there are those of us, perhaps, the two of us, who, would be, essentially whistleblowing, but we're doing it for the same reasons.
Right.
the same reasons. And I really appreciated that he acknowledged that here. Now he doesn't go into it, and he really, there's just a few little, he sprinkles it a couple of places, throughout, saying, well, look, there also is this argument that that's why people do come forward. And I think that a lot of times people like us are misunderstood, as being, rabble rousers, and like worse, much worse, right? Called much worse. When in fact,
Homophobic, racist,
right, exactly, yes.
transphobic, even though I've never said anything about trans
Right,
people, really.
right. But accused of that, or when a when we don't self-censor, when we, and by not self-censoring, that could be anything from just, interrupting the flow of, of what we think is maybe exaggerated, or, patently false, or simply anecdotal evidence, without proper backup, all the way up to, really, arm waving, and, getting a lawyer involved, like everything, in between there, I think sometimes can be, and is, in the case of critical social justice, labeled as a version of unpatriotic, right? So it's,
Exactly.
yeah.
Because critical
Um,
social justice is weirdly patriotic, American patriotic. It's inversely
right,
patriotic, right? So
right.
the old fashioned American patriots would say that um, America is the home of the free and the brave, and it's the
Yes.
most wonderful, beautiful place in the world. And but underneath that is, it's such an important place, right? But the critical social justice advocates wouldn't disagree with that fundamentally. They wouldn't say it's the
Right.
home of the free and the brave, but they wouldn't dispute its importance in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
kind of consequences it can make in the world out there. They would instead see it as an evil empire that is doing all of these bad things and is in control of everything, right? So it's kind of an inverse patriotism. And this is why you
And
get
so
some.
it's this movement then that must be, sworn allegiance to, and
Right.
yeah, yeah,
And that's why you get
because
somebody like,
that's what's
yeah,
going to restore sort of the greatness. This, we are the answer to restore the greatness
well, not necessarily
of America.
restore, because they wouldn't have seen anything good within America in the first
Well,
place.
I mean, restore the reputation, I guess.
I,
The
I mean, I think that, there are some exceptions within the movement. I mean, Marilyn Masada is one critical social justice advocate who would identify with people, with the founding fathers, and some of the messages that they, albeit in a very strange way, that I wouldn't agree with, but nevertheless, she at least plays lip service to it. Um, Charles Mills as well, talks about all of the problems with America, but says nevertheless that, liberalism and American liberalism has been of a great benefit to the world. But I think that those two are outliers, really.
Mhm.
And more generally, if you look at the most consequential authors, which are the likes of, and again, I keep going back to this point. People will say, "Oh, you're picking on D'Angelo and Kendi," when they're not sophisticated
There's
thinkers.
Yeah,
They're the
they're
ones that have
somewhat,
the influence.
yeah, yeah.
They're,
They
they're
are
the ones
somewhat,
who sell the
they are
books.
low hanging fruit, but
No, no, but it doesn't matter.
right.
If you're addressing a social movement, you address the causes, you address the most consequential parts of that movement. The most consequential parts are not the most nuanced thinkers, unfortunately.
Right.
If the most nuanced thinkers were the most consequential people within the movement wouldn't be what it is now.
Hmm.
We wouldn't have the problems that we had now.
Right.
If you had, God rest his soul, Charles Mills in charge of everything, you wouldn't get all of these cancellations. It just wouldn't happen. Um, you know, but sadly, he's not in charge of that movement, or he hasn't been.
Right.
It is the low hanging fruit, the Kendys and D'Angelos, and I'm sorry about that, but those are the people we have to engage with.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so anyway, I just wanted to mention that, this is kind of, sprinkled throughout. Also, I thought, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but um, the author suggests that not that self-censorship is actually sort of against, I don't know, to use the term loosely, I guess evolutionary, you know, uh, progress, evolutionary development, psychological development. So, well, physical also, but this idea that we our makeup, we have learned over time that we need to share. Okay, that we need to share for survival purposes, right? Physical survival. We need to share information to help one another. But then there's also these psychological benefits, therapeutic benefits. I mean, for example, and you know what, I was going to look up this article. It may be Harber and Pennybaker, but that when a Holocaust survivor was telling their survival story to an audience, they actually hooked up the survivor, the teller of the story, to galvanic skin response, and which is a measure of you know um, the sweat and stuff, and heart rate and that kind of thing. So they were measuring the physiological responses of the teller and the physiological responses of the listeners. And what happened was the tellers' markers of stress reduced. So as they were telling their story, they actually showed a reduction in stress, and the listeners had an increase in stress response. So the idea would be that so in this article they were talking about how essentially the listeners are now witnesses to the trauma. Okay, they have become witnesses. And as a witness, then you have you have social responsibilities, and as a listener you have caretaking responsibilities, and as the teller you have then shared your pain. You have made more sense of it. You've been able, we were actually just talking before we started the podcast about storytelling, right? You have now created a story out of chaos, and that is extremely beneficial to your health. So we have sort of these important sort of evolutionary, human evolutionary benefits to telling, and that it is sort of against our nature to self censor. And so I thought he did a pretty good job in a very short little area there, sort of arguing that self censorship would be difficult for people. It's difficult to hide these secrets sometimes, and it is that it has to be a motivated,
Is it
reason.
though? Okay. The most powerful experiences a person can have would vary. Have you ever and there's one of my favorite sculptures. It's in Rome. It's done by a guy called Bernini, chiseled out of marble. It's called The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And Saint Teresa would have these religious fits, probably caused by some kind of brain abnormality, some kind of epilepsy or something like that. But she would have these religious fits, like epilepsy of the frontal lobe. Is that the one that causes these grand religious visions? And
Yes, it can be. Yes, absolutely.
right, and so there's a statue of her. It's absolutely beautiful with all the kind of the folds in the cloths, and she's back like this, and she's having these religious visions that we would now recognize probably as epilepsy of the frontal lobes. But back then she was touched by God. That
Sure.
was so she was reporting an experience, a powerful experience that wasn't true. So he's arguing that it's important for us to share experiences. Well, sure, but does it matter whether or not these experiences are true?
I don't think in this section of the paper that it does to him.
Right.
I think he's making the argument that it's um, you know uh, that it builds community
Right. So
lying, essentially lying, not telling the truth, harms community, right? And telling, and even telling, again, sort of like in my example of witnessing, like we don't know for sure that we don't know that what we recall is all true. I mean, in fact, we could have a whole nother podcast about how, reconstructive memory is probably, it contains lots of falsehoods, right?
So
that doesn't mean that it's not useful, for society.
Well, so like if we look at like one of the most ancient human practices is religion, right? So if you're a Christian or you're a Muslim or you're a Hindu, you believe that your religion is the true one, and so therefore everything that happens around you, all of these religious visions and so on and so forth, that's all true. So let's just say I give you that. You have that. Everything you believe is true. You would still have to concede that the vast majority of religions, and therefore the vast majority of religious people, believe in false things, that it's all made up, right? So all of those communities that have sprung up, other than your religion, have been sprung up around people telling each other lies. I mean, that conclusion is surely inescapable, no? Like it would have to be, so that the most ancient of human practices, let's say, from the Stone Age, have sprung up around people telling each other lies and self-censoring and not telling each other contrary information, contrary religious perspectives, like your own, for example.
Okay. I mean, I guess I can't really argue that. I still
So I get that. I get that telling stories is important. I'm not disputing that, but people.
But I mean, we may be going like too far on a tangent here, but so I think that if we took your religion argument, there certainly are many examples of how, telling that, like, maybe some of those religious untruths are more like that dress looks nice on you, dear, right? Where we certainly can talk about, much larger religious untruths and self-censorship that led to, an entire colony to drink tainted Kool-Aid, right? And so that's his example of when self-censorship, harms a community and is no longer, these sort of like telling the truths to each other, telling our own truths, passing on information. Folk psychology basically is valuable.
Well, let me give you an example, and let me tie it very closely to self-censorship. And let me give you an example nearby where you are right now, Massachusetts, Salem. Are you trying to tell me that like a few of the people in Salem during those witch trials didn't think, holy fuck, this is a load of bollocks? Like some of them must have realized that this was all complete nonsense.
Oh yes. No, I mean, I don't know, we may be at cross purposes here, but like he's arguing that sharing troubling events is a good thing, and that is the that should be the default, and that's what's good for the community, that sharing these uncomfortable thoughts, that self-censoring is the abnormal, not the default.
I get what he's saying. I get, and I agree with what he's saying insofar as self-censorship is bad. No problems there. Identifying problems and being honest with them. Just to give you an example, if your partner is cheating on you, you would hope that one of your friends would tell you the painful truth, right? It would harm you in the short run, but it would have better outcomes in the long run. I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that he seems to be, if my understanding of his take is correct, he seems to be arguing that there's something against human nature with self-censorship. I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, I think that he is sort of,
I think
again,
it's very much in human
that
nature to self-censor.
that self-censorship is sort of um un
You could argue it's
I don't
unethical.
say,
Sure, I'd go with that. You could argue
yeah,
that it's from a
but yeah,
deontological point of view or a
he's just saying
consequentialist
that
point of view.
there's so much psychological evidence that sharing that, again, sort of oral history and all that kind of stuff, that it's, there's this long history of it, benefiting society. And that, so I think he's trying to set up this idea that self-censorship is, um, should be, I guess, should be
Adaptive.
an anomaly,
Right.
and
But
used for, used in particular circumstances for particular ends, that it's not sort of not the default for most people, that most people would want to be telling.
I think he's completely wrong. I think that self-censorship is adaptive for the group. Sorry.
Oh, yes.
Self-censorship is maladaptive for the group, but adaptive for the individual.
No, I agree, and I think that's what I actually think that is what he's saying, that for the health of the group, but there's also for the health of, again, for the health of the individual, it is best, oftentimes to tell. Although even in your marriage example, I think there's uh, a pretty strong argument to be made that if that affair was 10 years ago, you just keep your mouth shut, because if you're
Yeah,
happy,
maybe.
now, you just keep your mouth shut, right?
Uh-huh.
Because the only person you're helping is your own guilt by telling now. You're only helping your own guilt. You're not helping
But
the marriage.
let's put this in perspective of what we talk about, which is critical social justice. If you, let's say, if you had a niece or a nephew who was just going into academia and they said, I really need to speak out against all of this woke nonsense and all of this cancellation and bullying, would you advise them to speak out against it?
I most certainly would not. I most certainly would not. No, 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 no.
I,
However, I still do believe that is what is best for the group.
right.
So so exactly what you're
I
saying, it's like,
agree.
it's not, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then here's the thing, like, I would encourage that person to talk to me about it, to talk to people in private about it, right? To share, in areas of their life where it's safe to share those things, not to withhold them, not to bottle them up, but to share them, because because their health will benefit, and so will their that community where they're sharing that will benefit, that smaller, that maybe family unit or whatever.
So, again, for the most part, self-censorship is adaptive on an individual level.
I think you're right. I
And
do.
that's horrific.
It is. It's a little bit sad, yes. Um,
So why is it that individuals like us just say, sod it? Like, we know it's maladaptive and we do it anyway. We speak out anyway. Why is it that we do it?
I mean, I definitely don't. I definitely see myself self-censoring. I had to listen to an entire hour of,
Oh, yeah.
of how, just two recent department meetings. One, I had to listen to an entire hour of why there's no research going on in the department anymore. Right in front of me, the person who was, doing at a minimum at any given time, consuming 70% of the subject pool with her lab's research, who was canceled. So I'm not, so 70, at the minimum, 70% of the lab research that was going on in the department was done by me. I had to listen to an hour of people just saying that they didn't know why, and I didn't speak up. And then I told you just a couple weeks ago, I had to listen to an hour about how we're all so
I'm
horribly
so
racist.
exhausted. I'm so exhausted. It's so
Yeah,
difficult for me to say this. Oh,
exactly.
please validate
Yes,
my feelings. I'm exhausted. Oh, I
I'm
have to tell you
exhausted, but
these
I'm going to
truths.
keep going on.
But
In
I'm going
fact,
to
I
go
have a
on
power
and on and
and on.
on and
In
on
fact,
and
here's
on.
my PowerPoint presentation about how racist you all
And
are.
it's just so
So
difficult.
I didn't say anything. And again, here's the thing though. In this article, Bar-Tal says that is not self-censorship. So
Mm.
the reason so here's the thing. So the author is saying that when you feel that speaking would be futile, when it is useless, when it is, I mean, I'd have to find the exact, when essentially when it's, when you don't care enough, when you're, just, beaten down, that's not in this, again, in this author's very narrow definition, that would not be self-censorship, because you have decided that it is not information that would inform the group, that would be received, or that would be, that you decide is important enough, or that you think other people would think is important enough. So they're really talking about, self-censorship to protect the group, to protect the self, mostly to protect the group. The self is only one in this article, in this particular article. The self is only one of 6 reasons why you would self-censor. So I think that
I've got
there are
them here.
6. And am I
5,
right
isn't
that
it?
there
I think it's 5.
5? Okay, 5.
Speaking
So
out
this,
might, yeah, I can run through them. Speaking out might very well make them a target. That's the first one.
that's the one that we're talking. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have negative implications for those members of the group who had made the allegations, as well as those who had gone along with the allegations, whether they knew them to be bogus or not. This is me paraphrasing, not quoting.
Yeah.
It may cause a bigger conflict within the group and chaos. So like, for example, one person might say, oh, if you were to talk out at this, oh, I'm so exhausted. Like, how many times have I heard the same
Right.
speech? They say the same things. Oh, you're so exhausted, and that's why you're going through this again and again and again and again at length.
Right.
But somebody in the group, like, okay, here's if you were to object, I would be on your side, of course, but
Yes.
if I was to object to you objecting, here would be my objection. Oh, for God's sake, just let them get it over and done with. I know it's a load of bollocks. I just want to go home. I just want to go home. I don't want to have all of the chaos and all of the difficulty of sorting out this shit. If I have to be on your side, I'm going to be on your side.
Right.
But just don't cause an issue. It's like, when you're an undergraduate and it's the end of class and somebody is asking questions, just
yeah.
It's like, you can wait till the end and then ask the question. And they're asking, and if they're asking an interesting question, fair enough. But often it's just like, oh, look at me, I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
And like, I remember getting annoyed with that. It's like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah. But again, the author really suggests that that's not the kind of self-censorship that he's, and that's, there. Yeah. So
that's what
I'm not saying I
read.
agree. I'm not saying I agree. I'm
Sure.
just saying that
You're saying you're not. That's what I read one of his courses as being. Maybe I was wrong. The next one would be, it may, and this is important, it may undermine a cherished and or politically expedient belief, such as universities in North America are the bastions of white supremacy, for example.
Right. And so if I had interjected, then, it would have, hurt their sensey poo little feelings.
Right. I mean, let's just quickly go into the claim, right? Are there white supremacists at universities in America? I'm sure there are.
Yes, I'm sure there are.
Are there white supremacists in every segment of America? I'm sure there are there too. However, are there relatively few in universities compared to all other segments of American society? Yes, I'm pretty sure that there are almost, compared to other segments of American society, there are basically close to nothing.
Right.
There are one or two there, but there aren't very many. And those who are there, I'm very confident will be self-censoring all the time as a consequence of their environments being hostile to them. Whereas those people who want to say that these contexts are racist can claim that they're exhausted and go on and on and on. because the context is receptive to that kind of belief. So yeah, it may undermine. So people don't speak out because it may undermine a cherished, either they believe it or perhaps a politically expedient belief. And then, and here is another serious and maybe more earnest one. It may harm an allied category of people.
Right.
So you may think that this person banging on about how exhausted they are and how difficult it is to share something that everyone is listening to, you may think that it's nonsense, but you may think, I'm not going to speak out against this because this person is standing up to racism. Whether they are or not, I would say they're not, but maybe you believe that they are.
Right.
And that's an important thing to do. And I certainly agree that that is an important thing to do. You should stand up to racism as and when you experience it or encounter it. So you may not want to speak out because of that. So I think those were that was under his category for, because he talks about two kinds of self-censorship, doesn't he? He talks about conformity.
Well, yeah, but I wanted to mention before we get to the conformity, compliance, and obedience, I wanted to talk about, because this speaks to what we were just talking about, that one of his criteria is that if there's no dilemma, then it's not self-censorship. So you must experience a dilemma in order for, so you have to have the third psychological basis of self-censorship refers to this dilemma. A person is aware of possessing new, unexposed information that is relevant to society and should be revealed, but at the same time is aware that revealing that information violates another principle, norm, dogma, ideology, or value that may cause harm. So I again, he's sort of saying, like, essentially, if the information is not worth sharing, won't have any effect, then, and if you're not in a dilemma about whether to share the information, then you're not self-censoring. Again, I'm not saying that I agree, but that dilemma is very key, in his argument that the person has. That's a criteria.
Dilemma.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you that I think it's on a almost automatic behavior that that I'm not as convinced about the dilemma. Angst, I definitely experienced angst. I don't know that in those two meetings, I don't know that I experienced a dilemma. I was certainly personally frustrated and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't necessarily a dilemma.
Yeah.
I did believe that it would be better, not worse, for them to hear it, but I didn't believe that it would make a difference, and that any difference that it made would probably it would only be harmful
It
to
would be
me.
harmful to you, yeah. What would happen?
That it wouldn't. If I thought it would make a difference and be harmful to me, then I might do it, right? If I didn't think it would be harmful to me, and I just thought, well, it's not going to make a difference, but I think that people should hear it, because the more you hear something, the more open you become to it, then maybe I would have done it. But the fact that I thought it will have no effect and except to be harmful to me, that I decided to self-censor.
I think
But he would argue that that's not self-censorship.
I think that, I don't know, but I think that it might have had an effect, albeit one that would come at a horrendous cost.
Yeah.
So, but then again, I don't know, because like your situation is very different to mine. So when you were bullied, I mean, I would argue you still are being bullied, but
I was going to say let's not use past tense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when let's say it was at its apex point, when the cancellation was at its apex point, when it all started exploding, nobody sided with you.
No.
And you didn't lash back out at, see what they would have wanted you to do would be to lash out at them and start telling them to fuck off, and you're wise enough not to do that, because then they would have, oh, we're such terrible victims, rah, 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 rah. What you could have, I mean, so I don't, your situation is different to mine, right? So when I spoke out against, well, you didn't even speak out, right? You had something that was seized, taken completely out of context.
Right.
It was a piece of reported speech. You weren't making an assertion. It was a piece of
No.
reported speech that was taken completely out of
Right.
context,
Yes.
clearly, in a
In
Machiavellian way.
within the body of a survey document,
Yeah, you were just
that
looking at
was
what is the effect of this speech and that speech. You weren't
right,
saying that this
right,
speech is true or not true. You weren't making any statement
right,
about it, right? So it was a
right,
piece of reported speech that was deliberately taken out of context in a clearly Machiavellian way, so that somebody could then post it up online, lie that you were asserting this thing to be true, so as to gain social status, and then that worked, and all of these people just went along with the lie, even though maybe some of them actually believed the lie to be true. But anybody, and shame on them, because if you're just going to believe something like that without checking,
right.
what kind of person are
Yeah,
you? You call yourself an academic, really?
right.
That your level of evidence-based thinking. So shame. So you're either an idiot, a coward, um,
Lazy,
okay, lazy, yeah,
lazy.
yeah, lazy, an idiot, or a coward, or just a nasty person, really.
Yeah.
So that was your experience. My experience was a bit different. I was essentially in. It was an online meeting, but it was a meeting which was very similar to the one you were just in. Not what caused your cancellation, but the one in which
Right.
somebody was
The
saying, "I'm
recent.
so
Yeah.
exhausted," rah 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 rah,
Right.
and I spoke up. I didn't, I just said, "Really, what's your basis for this?" I didn't say this is not what you're experiencing. I didn't invalidate them. I just said, "What's your basis for this?" And that was enough for them to go completely crazy, and go out of their way to try and wreck my life. But I was lucky because in my context, people saw what they were doing
In real time, they
in
could.
real
Yeah.
time. Yeah, it was in that. Maybe that's the difference. It was in real time, and it was all in a record. There was all like a whole chat log for it. People
Mm-hmm.
saw what they were doing. Even people who didn't like me and liked them,
Mm-hmm.
and just said, "No, this isn't on." It was a key difference. So that. So what I was going to suggest is that you're in a situation like that where that kind of meeting is going on. If you say something, then in my case, what it did was brought on immense personal cost to me as an individual, because they just went
Mm-hmm.
after me with everything they could. And it was highly, highly stressful, but it did make a difference, because those people who would have said before, cancel culture doesn't exist, it's just people speaking up to power,
Right. Right.
they'd now seen it.
Right.
They'd now witnessed it. They couldn't deny it was a thing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably still don't like me, but they now know that critical social justice exists and it's a problem. So whether you're prepared to pay that price is another thing
Right.
entirely. And
Right.
if you're not, that's perfectly cool. But I that's what happened in my context. But given that you didn't even object to anything, and basically
I
your
know.
whole cancellation was based on an outright fabrication, just complete, like,
Yeah.
out of nowhere, people made it up. Then I maybe if you had have said something, it would have had no impact
Right.
whatsoever, apart from
Right. Or
apart
made it
from
worse.
or just made it worse. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe nobody would have stood up. God,
Yeah.
what a place to work.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Um. So. Um. So have we talked about, I don't think we're still not at the, have we talked about do we want to talk about any of the other motivations? You kind of went through the motivations, right? So we've, uh, you know, we're sort of through that piece, and we've talked a little bit about, the protections of Israelis, positive self-image, right? As
which is
a,
understandable.
right. The motivation of Israeli Jewish citizens intended to protect the in-group, protection of um, Zionist ideology. So the soldier needs a sense of purpose. The duty of education is to bring the soldier to willingness, protect the Zionist narrative, institutional norms, protecting sort of the protecting the state, feeling like you're a part of the organizational fabric of the state.
See, this
And
one's
then,
quite
of
important.
course,
The institutional norms, I think, are quite important. So what the paper talks about is a study in which they're looking at, a hypothetical situation where you are a civilian observer and you see Israeli soldiers going out and attacking, just physically abusing some innocent Palestinians. And they found that if you were a citizen observer, you were more likely to whistleblow. If you were a soldier observer, you were less likely to whistleblow. So the institutional norms is this idea is that you believe that you are a part of an institution. And if you believe and you identify with that institution, you are less likely to blow the whistle. So, for example, if the people that you worked with saw what happened to you and they had come in as an independent observer of the university, perhaps sent by the government, they would be more likely to put their hands up and say, the same individual would be more likely to put their hands up and say, hold on, something's not right here,
right.
than they would be embedded as a tenured academic at the university.
Right. And already entrenched, sort of in the movement, right? So there's,
right.
And of course, fear of sanctions, that's what we keep coming back to. So,
yeah.
And again, in this author's, we just have to, that for this author, it has to be unspoken, sort of could be generally agreed upon, but not sort of not really spoken necessarily aloud. So, like this is, one of their interviewees said, I'll call it political pressure because there was constantly the concern that there would be scandal. Many things could have been done to us. They could have told us, we're sick of you journalists being here. So this sort of idea that it could happen, as, sort of fear of sanctions, but no formal sanctions exist, but that there, that there's that fear of it. And yeah, that I really liked that study where they had the participants observing the interaction and deciding whether, it's a little bit different though in a study, right, where you can, you say, oh yeah, I would speak out, and
yeah, but if they're noticing an effect even in a hypothetical study, right, then you'd have to conclude that in reality the effect would be even stronger.
Yes. Well, yeah, we would hope so. Because you're in the safety of a lab, which is
right.
different. Yeah. So then we get in the paper, unless you don't want to go there yet.
No, sure. Go anywhere.
The author is arguing that this self-censorship is not related to some really, I think, well-researched sort of general principles in psychology that, of conformity, compliance, and obedience. There's not a lot of, it's clearly, this section, it's not super long, but it's clearly this author's assertion. So he doesn't cite articles that back up his his position. This is definitely his position. He's making it clear that he does not believe that self-censorship is an example of, so we'll start with conformity.
Okay.
So now he does cite sort of a famous conformity researcher. So conformity is the tendency to change one's beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors to match those of others who are in the majority. So that's the definition that he's using here.
Or we should say
and
perceived to be in the majority, right?
uh
We should say, and he's not saying that, we should say that.
yes. So and he's again sort of making the distinction between private conformity, which would be you actually accept that the attitude of the majority, or public conformity where you simply don't object, right? So this paragraph at the beginning where he's defining conformity and defining informational and normative conformity. So informational conformity is when and I think this is really relevant to critical social justice. Informational conformity is when we're not sure, right? And so we defer to maybe the majority, or an outspoken well-spoken maybe person, because we aren't sure. I'm not really sure how common how common racism is in police work. And so I listen to someone who seems to have knowledge on the subject. And so I conform because that person is appears to be more informed, is an expert, that kind of thing. So that would be informational conformity, where we're not really sure how to interpret our environment or whatever. There's some really famous studies on that. And then normative conformity, where we go along sometimes rather mindlessly. Fashion is an example where
I've got a great example. I've got a great example from Japan.
Yeah.
Like, I was with a friend years ago, and a new donut shop had opened, and there was a huge line outside the donuts, and she didn't actually really like donuts, but she had to join the line to get the new donuts from the donut shop, because like everybody was doing it.
Everybody's doing it.
Oh, must be good. There must be something amazing about it.
Yes.
She ate the donut, and she was like,
yeah. Okay, so here's the arguments that this author is saying, that he's making. So he's saying that self-censorship is not related to the perception of being in the minority or the majority. Instead, self-censorship is the understanding that providing the information might hurt the in-group. So conformity would be, in this author's, it's just that your view would not be accepted by society, where self-censorship might actually hurt society. So being accepted by society versus that it might hurt society. So saying that society members. So in self-censorship, it's not about the majority belief. It's about, again, sort of harming other people. So I don't know how you feel about that, but it's that's a he's making a distinction between conforming because we want to fit in, I guess, not rock the boat, versus we don't want to cause harm.
I think individuals are quite nefarious.
Well, I mean,
in general,
I really do think, I don't know. I mean, I think that that I do believe that self-censorship can simply be a rather mindless act of conformity.
Sometimes
this is exactly your perfect example earlier. Was like, no, not the donut. Actually, I was thinking of the meeting where you're thinking, you know what, I want to get out of this meeting as fast as I can. Maybe I'm actually scrolling on my like I'm in this meeting, but I'm not really paying attention. I'm, like I just one of the things that speaking out does is it's going to use up cognitive resources that you can spend thinking about what you're going to get at the grocery store on your way home. I mean, you're thinking up, in terms of an academic meeting, your next class, or, that kind of thing. So I do think that there's a sense of sort of momentum, sort of
Right.
that comes that that's conforming, and other people aren't speaking, and so you don't speak either. That is the donut shop example, right? And I also think that there's an aspect of informational conformity where you're kind of looking around, um, and this is when, you ask your students, you say, what questions do you have? Right? It's like, oh, I just introduced this new topic. What questions do you have? And nobody asks a question. And there's this sense of they call it pluralistic ignorance, right? Where everybody else thinks that each person thinks that everybody else understands, right? And so when, and this happens to us in, maybe in those kinds of meetings that we were talking about, or when somebody's being canceled, it's like, well, I don't know the whole story. I don't know enough. And those people seem to know what's going on. And so I defer to those people. So I do think that there's, that there's an aspect of
Sure.
conformity.
Sure. Fine. But let me give you another example. So in one of the events that led up to my cancellation, a person in question had gone through their long, I'm exhausted, all that kind of nonsense. And then at the end, they said, that was really hard to write. I would appreciate some validation.
Mm-hmm.
And the person was asking for likes, right? So people to click like on what that person had written. And many people did validate that. Now,
Right.
maybe some of them genuinely thought that person was actually exhausted. Maybe, probably not, maybe one or two. But among the people who clicked the like were people who knew that individual was not only being manipulative, but was actually toxic, like really toxic,
So
because that individual had
that,
latched out.
right. And again, like, this author would argue that doesn't fit, but that would be not conformity, but compliance, right? So compliance is when, somebody specifically asks you to do something. You don't, you would prefer not to. You don't, but you do anyway. So that's not just conformity, but that's compliance, where someone has asked you and you comply, even though you'd rather not. So I agree with you. Again, this author says no, that would not be that compliance doesn't fit here. But I agree with you. So here's another argument for why it's not specifically in this case conformity. In the case of conformity, um, group members do not express either an opinion or information, where self-censorship is the withholding of knowledge that is viewed as truthful. So this is what we were talking about earlier, right? Where he's saying that an opinion, withholding an opinion is not self-censorship. Self-censorship is only the withholding of knowledge. So self-censorship does not include opinions because it is clear. Get this. This is, I put an exclamation point by this. Self-censorship does not include opinions because it is clear that group members are entitled to hold different opinions, and they are subjective reflections in contrast to validated information. That does not work with
No,
critical social justice. No, because it is definitely not clear. At least in my life, maybe it's clear in your life,
no,
but it is not
it
clear.
doesn't work even within the realm of Israeli defense either. Like,
Okay.
it's well understood that there are these pressures in Israeli defense, and it's well understood that this led to the most traumatic day in Israeli history. and that people need to be able to buck the social pressure that is really existent and say their own opinion. That's like crystal clear within Israeli defense literature. I don't know where he's getting that from.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I like the paper, but that's nonsense.
Yeah. Okay, and then let's see, avoidance versus approach. Now, this is like sort of the an approach emotion, for example, would be anger, and an avoidance emotion would be maybe fear or anxiety. So, self-censorship focuses on silence or the withholding or avoidance of an action. That's what he's saying. But conformity, in contrast, implies an action, acting or reacting in line with the majority. So self-censorship is a withdrawal, where conformity would be an approach, kind of. I think this is, I like the idea. It doesn't quite work here.
I think it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is quite common amongst academics. They'll try and kind of divide things up in a way that doesn't really work.
Yeah.
Like I would say that I would put these things along a spectrum. I put conformity and obedience on a spectrum, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can get to conformity as an action. I do get it as an action in the donut example, but I don't really get it in some of the others. But anyway, different reactions to the collective. So
Yeah, so
in
go
this,
back to your example. Like, could
oh yeah,
conformity be an action? Could it be a non-action? Well, let's say the social pressure is not to ask a question in class, right? But you're asleep.
Right. You mean like all of my students? Yeah.
You should come to Japan, like seriously, people
Yeah.
sleep in lectures.
Okay, so self-censorship leads to the withholding and concealing of information from the collective. Conformity, on the other hand, leads to an adoption of the collective's majority views. So either in form or in either superficially or more deeply. So self-censorship leads to withholding and concealing from the collective. Conformity leads to adoption of the collective. Motivation. The principal motivation in self-censorship is to protect the group. In the case of conformity, the primary motivation is always to protect one's self.
I would argue that the primary motivation is always to protect oneself in both cases. For
Yeah.
most people, most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's lovely to say that you're self-censoring, for the good of the greater good or whatever. But I think it might be hard,
You
might be
might
hard
be
pressed
might be justifying it that way to yourself or to others.
Right.
And I have no doubt that that's actually true for some people sometimes. But generally speaking, I think all of this stuff is personally motivated.
Yeah. Again, maybe just out of fear, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that fear can be very real. Like we're not suggesting that the fear is not real.
No.
Yeah, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean nobody's
They're not
after you, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Knowledge, and this is the informational conformity. So they're saying that in informational conformity, individuals accept the view as reflecting reality. I'm not sure I really believe that. I don't know that people necessarily accept it as reality. I think maybe they accept it because they're saying, I don't know enough. I'm going to defer. I don't think that's the same thing as necessarily I'm going to now believe that. But anyway, that they're yielding to the informed other. But in self-censorship, the information that the individual holds is clear to them.
So,
and the wish is to prevent valid knowledge. So in informational conformity, you're yielding to valid knowledge, but in self-censorship, you're preventing valid knowledge. That's what he's arguing here. So I wrote down that would, I don't believe that would be true. So I wrote down, that would apply to research knowledge. What about when we're afraid to share research knowledge?
Well, just like the last paper we did when they kept saying we're not writing about critical social justice.
Right, right.
Clearly were, and they were just afraid to say it, right? So they were self-censoring to a degree. I mean, I think they were kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
So I'm not sure that I don't know that. So that article, for example, they wanted to advance knowledge. They found a way to advance knowledge by maybe conforming, right, to some extent, but still.
And to be fair, if they hadn't, it probably wouldn't have got published.
Right. No, I'm sure not. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, you can look at that as, okay, we had to do this kind of slightly underhand thing. Them's the rules, right? I mean, it would have been worse had they not have done, because we wouldn't have ever read it.
Right. And so then they're also arguing that it's, or, the author's also arguing that it doesn't, that self-censorship is not obedience, because obedience refers to the blind execution of orders. But self-censorship refers to the withholding of information on a person's own initiative without receiving explicit orders to do so.
Yeah, that's an important caveat, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from the critical social justice types I've come across, like, you don't want to reveal information to them. Like, you don't want to tell them that, no, you're not the victim here, for example. You know that they're not the victims. Even though that's kind of important information that they need to hear.
Yeah.
I'm seriously, especially I'm not talking about the ones who would stand up and say, I'm exhausted, and then go on, because clearly they know that they're not the victims. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing that, right? Because if you're in a really racist environment, nobody would give a fuck. And either they wouldn't care, or they'd start throwing tomatoes at you, and like, you're so they know that that's clearly a dishonest act. But the real victims of critical social justice ideology are basket case. I mean, the people who go along with it and believe it is real are basket cases. I mean, have you ever met one? Do you know any? Like, especially young people who will lock themselves up in their room because they believe that everything is sexist, racist, homophobic. They're terrified of going outside. I've known these people, and they absolutely. I'm one of them that I knew quite well. Really nice person, really switched on, intelligent, in the orbit of a narcissist. And this person believed that everything was racist and homophobic and the rest of it, and that everyone was out to get that person, and basically had a mental breakdown as a consequence, a really serious mental breakdown. And I don't know what is happening to them right now, and I really hope the best for them. But they believed that they were a victim of me rather than the narcissist who was feeding them all this validation, you really being oppressed. So there is a difference.
They have this very, the author has this very complicated model here.
Yes, it was rather complicated.
Yeah, it's
the vignette.
Oh no, I meant the on page 56. Their little.
Oh yeah, that one, the diagram. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the diagram. Yes, of so it's a bit. I mean, they got it all in. There's a lot of factors in there, so there's a lot to test on in the future. just kind of, they're getting to this point of the positive consequences of self-censorship. So basically, mostly in this article, it's been, they've been
Negative.
sort of talking about, and now they're saying, it allows for the maintenance of positive self-image, positive social identity, prevents potential harm to the in-group from outside parties, increases unity and solidarity by preventing disagreements, controversies, and schisms. So,
So
I don't know.
let's conclude, right? Well, what would that be good for? So of course, like these behaviors wouldn't exist if there wasn't an adaptive dimension to them, right?
Absolutely.
They would have dropped out of the gene pool.
Yes.
So self-censorship is clearly important to a degree, right? And we started the podcast by saying if your boyfriend, wife, girlfriend, whatever gets a haircut and you think it looks not very good,
Right.
do you tell them immediately? Do you try and
Maybe not at all.
or not at
It'll grow.
all? Yeah, right.
You know?
Maybe you'll just think, oh, it will grow, and then when it's grown out, you can tell them maybe so they don't get it done again.
Or you just say, "Oh, your hair. I really like your hair this way." Yes, and you never had to tell them that you didn't like it the other way.
Like the scheming Machiavellian you are, Spivak.
Yes.
So clearly there is an adaptive side to self-censorship in any context, right? And it's something that we do at least several times a day. However, there's clearly negative self-censorship. I mean, I guess we could talk about Evergreen. Do you know Evergreen, where the Brett Weinstein?
Yeah.
And there must be loads of people there who know that place has gone to hell.
Yes.
And they didn't speak out. And now the institution has deteriorated to a sad state and will continue.
In fact, I'm not sure. I think that they have done a couple of searches for a new president and have been unable to. They've had a temporary, they can't even hire a new leader, I think.
Right. So it will harm, if you go along with all the nonsense and you don't speak out against it, well, it will benefit you to a limited degree. You'll be safe, maybe, or maybe not, like in the case with your case where they just made stuff up about you,
Right.
So you might not be, but you may, you stand a better chance of being safe. Maybe you won't attract the ire of the mob, but eventually if that mob continues, then it will destroy the context you exist in.
Exactly. And I think that there's an argument to be made that, especially in academia, that is exactly what's happening.
Oh, it's exactly what's happening. Yeah.
That it's consuming itself. It's like I don't know. It's an ugly, dirty mess, and no one is really safe.
No.
Even though, no one is really safe.
It was the same thing in Mao's China. Okay, well, I'm not saying that we're being killed, but it's the same psychological process that's going on, right? There are these purges, and they want to target people who are genuinely guilty of homophobia and racism. That's who they'll first go for. But the supply of those people doesn't match the demand,
right?
Because there aren't very many people like that, and if there are, I'm sure there are some, but they will self-censor because they know what the consequence of speaking out will be. And so they just have to invent victims. They have to invent them.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, they said I was a homophobic psychopath who had bullied students, gay students. I've never bullied any students, let alone gay ones. Self-censorship, it might keep you safe for a while, but the whole of academia is being, and not just academia, legacy media, social media is being governed by these people.
So the society that you're, the collective, the group, the in-group that you're protecting becomes less and less worthy of protection. Although I'm not sure that that would increase people's willingness to speak out, because I think that we get back to the existential threat, right? And so, it's like you close ranks even more, and you're less and less willing, maybe. So.
So it's adaptive on the individual level in the short term, not so much in the medium to long term, because you're destroying your own environment, basically.
Yes, you're destroying the very thing that you're trying to protect beyond yourself, right? Mm-hmm. You're actually destroying. And And I think to some extent, those of us who self-censor, I think, you know, it destroys some of us, a little bit of us sometimes too, depending on our
Yes,
own personalities and our own, style of adapting to the environment. I think it can be very detrimental to our own. And I mean, and that's what the author was saying early on, that, sharing really is a useful, productive, thing for the individual and for the group. And so now we're kind of circling back around to that to say, it can be, that the self-censorship, it's harmful to the group in the long term. It's harmful to the individual in the long term.
we can't be
It's
you.
not,
You
it's not
can't be you.
adaptive. Yeah. It's
No.
adaptive in the moment, but not adaptive in the long term.
And so we're kind of at this kind of evolutionary dilemma, right? We've got this set of behaviors that are adaptive in the short term and maybe adaptive in the long term for a select few individuals who really know the ideology. And well, no, actually, because most of them don't know the ideology, they just
No.
parrot
Yeah.
kind of nonsense. But who can be seemingly pious, you know. But it's just destroying context. It's destroying academia. It's destroying legacy media. It's destroying the corporate world. I mean, you look at what's happening to Disney at the moment with their stocks and the viewership of their programs. So, at some point you have to stand up to it. But then, would we recommend that people stand up to it? That's the point.
So I was very interested, so at towards the end of the paper here, they're talking about a longitudinal study, and they have several measures: general support for self-censorship, support for self-censorship during Israel's operation of Pillar Defense in the Gaza Strip, support for self-censorship in other nations, right-wing authoritarianism. These are all things that they're measuring. Ethnocentrism. And then I've never heard this. So the third selected antecedent, so an individual difference variable, is basically what they're saying. Like we were talking the last couple of podcasts about the dark triad. This would be, a version of that, an individual difference measure, specific to the participants. Siege mentality, which reflects the generalized societal belief that the whole world is against the in-group, deep feelings of threat, and a sense of of collective victimhood. So this is a scale that this particular author had developed in 1992. Apparently, I did not have time to look it up, but I'm very interested in that measure.
So that's what I was talking about earlier on when I was saying that there's never really been a time when Israel hasn't been at war.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that there is very much a siege mentality. They believe, and they're right to believe, in my opinion, that if the countries that surround Israel thought that they could get away with attacking them, they would attack them. I mean, they would like to wipe Israel off the map, and say so. Iran says so, and so that does create a sense of, correctly, I think, create a sense of victimhood. They're correct to believe that.
Yeah.
With critical social justice, what it does is it manipulates a sense of victimhood. So it looks at things that are real, such as racism, and it seeks to kind of amplify that sense of victimhood. It tries to say things like, okay, the civil rights movement happened, great progress was made against explicit racism. All of that's wonderful. Thank you very much. But, and this is, really, D'Angelo is the one who is most popular for making this clear, although they all do this. But there is this kind of subliminal racism that is existing, mm-hmm. and then in my case, I was accused of being unconsciously racist.
Right.
So my accuser didn't think that I believed in a hate group or I was part of the KKK. My accuser would have thought that I completely am opposed to all of that stuff, of course. But I'm nevertheless guilty of implicit racism, and so
I think
generating
that's
this sense
one of the most common
victimhood.
accusations. Yeah.
I'm sure that's what was leveled at you as well.
Oh yes,
or
yes.
maybe not. I don't know.
Yes.
Or maybe both, in fact, because you were,
both, exactly.
Yeah.
It's both. Like even if you're not an actual racist, well, then you're unconsciously.
So they are and this is why I do think that Machiavellian narcissists are behind this, right? Because I have seen the victims of this, the victims of the ideology who are in the ideology, both as a true believer and in the good graces of people in the ideology. So nobody's trying to cancel them, right? And they're absolute basket cases. They're a complete mess. They don't want to talk about what they're being made victim to because they genuinely believe they're victims, and they have all of the anxiety and everything, everything that goes along with being a genuine victim. They are victims. They're not victims of people like you and I. They're victims of the Machiavellian narcissists. And then the Machiavellian, again, this is anecdotal, but the Machiavellian narcissist types will say that they're victims. They'll get up and at length give you a PowerPoint presentation and talk their way through it, but they won't exhibit any of the behavioral patterns that are well understood to be associated with victimhood. But there's no anxiety. There's no kind of stuttering. There's no sense of threat. The body language is very confident.
That's what we were talking about. The virtuous victim, right? They are actually empowered by their victimhood. And so I would just be really interested in comparing this siege mentality measure to the virtuous victimhood and some of those measures that we talked about in the previous two.
Sure.
I just think it would be really interesting because I had not heard of that particular measure. Anyway, again, this is where once again they found that the participants said that people who disclose that self-censorship was negatively related to support for democratic values, constructive patriotism, that it's anti-liberal, right? Self-censorship. But again, that they're going to do it for the greater good. So it's good, it's bad for others, but I'm going to choose to do it. So the self-censorship factor was negatively related, so negatively correlated to support for abstract democratic values, okay, to patriotism. And so negative relationship between self-censorship and constructive patriotism, a positive relationship between self-censorship and support negative and support for universalistic values. Breaking the silence was positively correlated to abstract democratic values, constructive patriotism, and support for universalistic values. It was negatively correlated with conformity, right-wing authoritarianism, blind patriotism, and support for a group narrative.
Wait, so does that mean we're not right-wing authoritarians?
I believe it does. Yes.
Who would have thunk it?
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
So they kind of conclude this, interestingly, I thought it was kind of interesting that this article concluded with essentially a survey, individual differences, kind of correlational kind of thing, sort of again hearkening back to the dark triad articles where they're just trying to figure out who these who individuals are as while the what kinds of individuals do this, while the article was sort of framing itself at the beginning as what are the social constructs that are related to this. They sort of end with what are the personal constructs, the personality and individual differences. And again, I can't help. I always feel the need to say I'm probably boring you and anybody. if we haven't bored everybody else by now, but I just feel the need to say that I just don't think we should alienate or demonize any individual difference variables, whether that's personality or some of these more or less individualistic, more or less constructive patriotism. I think there's value in in variety and differences. And so, I enjoyed, I, I enjoyed this article. I think that there's some of the things like annoyed me, and that's one of the things that annoyed me, that they ended on this individual differences kind of personality kind of I don't know, topic.
Yeah, I think as liberals, it may be that certain personality types predict for different behaviors. Some of the time, it doesn't mean that
Some
if you
of the
have
time,
those, it's
right,
not predetermined. We're not like,
right,
from an Isaac Asimov book where we can do a test of your personality traits and that means that you're going to be an evil person.
right.
No, and the evidence doesn't support that. It does take all sorts. And if you're a bit Machiavellian, and you know how to get one over on these people who are really messing up our institutions, we could do with your help. We really could,
And
because
yeah,
sometimes it takes fire to fight fire, honestly.
exactly,
And
exactly.
we're
And
not naive in that regard.
we are in some ways in a siege environment, and so when you're in that kind of environment, again, circling back to where we started,
Right.
different kinds of personalities, different kinds of behaviors, different kinds of speaking out or self-censorship are useful, valid, really good tools. So
Right, and let's also admit fault with ourselves and people that we've been allied with, right? That some of them have gone a bit crazy and have gone down a kind of their own ideological rabbit hole. And it's hard sometimes, like Chris Rufo would be one who will do some really good on point stuff against critical social justice, but then will do some dishonest stuff as well, right? He'll allege that they did stuff or said stuff they didn't do, or exaggerate, or use their own tactics against them. It works, he's highly effective in that, but I'm not comfortable with that. And I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna be the kind of person who doesn't speak out about stuff like that. So the pressure to conform, it's not just only on the critical social justice types. It happens within the resistance as well, I think. And if we want to be better, we have to stand up to that as well. So groupthink is something that not groupthink, we're talking about conformity or self-censorship, but it's something that we're guilty of as well. And we have to be vigilant to.
Yeah. And I think that there's something in the I don't think we want to call ourselves whistleblowers, but I do think that when we do find the courage, an opportunity, if you will, to speak up, that I think maybe sometimes we should, there's an obligatory explanation that should come with it, that I am speaking up because I care about the group. And I wonder if that, that might, there might be a way to speak up and remind people of that.
I hate to say this, but like in my experience, like I always framed like my objection to kind of critical social justice and woke ideology, as saying, look, as somebody that is from the left, I wasn't even talking about academia. I was talking about the left more broadly. This is going to destroy us unless we recognize this problem and speak out against it. And
doesn't help.
I was just called alt-right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. Well, I guess when you think about, when you tell your kids, I'm doing this because I love you, it doesn't work either. So
no, sadly not. I don't know. But
we are doing it because we are doing it out of love. You and I and people that we know, we really are speaking out.
It doesn't benefit me, right?
No.
I would be so much better off financially, career-wise, if I'd used the knowledge that I do have about this ideology in favor of the ideology. Exactly. I know people who are doing way better than me that don't really know about this stuff, and yet they're banging the drum all the time. So I don't know why I'm doing it. I feel like, but I don't know. I think I must have some sense of I'm trying to be a hero. That's what I think it is.
Right.
That's what I think I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Yes. We did a podcast about that too.
We did trying to be a hero. And a lot of them are trying to be heroes as well.
Yes.
Not all of them, but a lot of them are.
No,
so
but we definitely saw ourselves in that article.
Yeah, we did. All right, on that note, keep fighting the good fight. Thank you very much. All right, let's end there.